Good evening, council members, Mayor, Deputy Mayor. Thank you for having us here tonight. We are here to give you a further presentation on the recommendation that the Planning Commission put forward for the step housing code amendments. So we have provided some draft code, and we will be talking through some of the big principles of what they looked at, what they considered, and what their ultimate recommendation was. They put a lot of time into this. I do want to note, I think we had 5 meetings on this potentially. And the Planning Commission really considered it all very, very deeply and really spent a lot of time trying to balance the needs of the community also with the requirements from the state. And I think they came up with a really good package. So we're happy to present that this evening. I'll go ahead and pass it on to Cheney.
Hi, good evening, Council. I'm Cheney Skazin, Senior Planner, and tonight is, sorry, not a public hearing. Ignore that on the slide. This is an overview of the meeting. We already had our public hearing at Planning Commission on October 23rd. So the purpose of this meeting, or what we're going to discuss, is the proposed step housing code amendments, and then discuss the Planning Commission's recommendation for your consideration. We wanted to do this to have the time to go through the actual proposed code amendment in a little more detail ahead of when we come to introduce the ordinance, because that should be more of a higher level procedural meeting. And this is a time that we can dive into the details. And if there are such consensus or requests for us to come back or look into something more, we have this kind of 1 meeting window to do so. So in short, the proposed step housing code amendments define new terms. A lot of these come from the state statute from House Bill 1220. The proposed code also outlines the processes and procedures for which step housing uses would be required to follow, to be established, or to expand in the city of Burien. And then there are applicable zoning and development regulations for each step housing type, and those align with the House Bill 1220 requirements, as well as are responsive to the concerns and topics brought up at Planning Commission. We'll dive into those in a little more detail. You may remember this map. I showed it before. This is a summary map. This is not a zoning map. This map is a tool for us to have a more easily or more simple conversation around where certain step housing types are required by state law to be permitted. The blue area are areas or zones in our city in which hotels are a permitted use, and where all 4 step housing uses would be or are going to be proposed for as allowed uses, whereas the gradient red, orange, brown colors are zones that don't allow for hotels but allow for residential uses. So based on the House Bill 1220 requirements, permanent supportive housing and transitional housing are the only step housing types that we are required to allow in these uses, or in these zones. You may notice there are other zones in the city that don't allow for hotels or for residential. That's our industrial zoning, and that is not lit up on this map. It's white. So no step housing types are proposed in those zones or are required to be allowed in those zones. So we've talked about this before, but I just want to kind of reiterate how different step housing types can look different based on their locations. In the RS zones, our single family or traditional single family zones, where or also multifamily zones, but particularly in the RS zones, single family, permanent supportive housing and transitional housing are required to be allowed as permitted uses. And in the proposed code, we have drafted that up to 3 permanent supportive housing units would be allowed. And because transitional housing doesn't have to meet the definition of a dwelling unit, we also include a provision for the number of beds. A unit to be declared or to be considered a dwelling unit, you need to have all the provisions for sleeping, eating, sanitation, whereas congregate housing or transitional housing, you may have more of a dormitory style. And this is basically a a way to address both permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. The images on the screen are an example from one of our panelists from Fusion. They bought a single-family home that had been burned or had burnt down and are building a duplex there for permanent supportive housing. So this type of housing, whether it looks like a duplex or it looks like a single-family home with an attached ADU or a detached ADU in the backyard, it does, in our opinion, fit the character of these zones, the RS zones. Emergency housing so I guess one thing I want to highlight, the review for these housing types would be similar to what a single-family home or ADU would be required. Similar, same level of review, which is permitted outright. You'll be using a building permit application and require compliance with all development regulations through that process. Whereas emergency housing, there we go. An example of emergency housing would be Mary's Place in our city. And that's a development that has 70 units and the capacity for about 200 people. And in our proposed development or regulations, we're considering or proposing a type 1 review and for any emergency housing projects with 35 units or more. So meaning that if there's a project with less than 35 units or beds, because this also doesn't need to meet the definition of a dwelling unit, then it could be permitted outright and you would be doing your development regulation compliance review with the building permit. There was also a conversation with the Planning Commission around how many emergency housing types, how many large emergency housing buildings or projects, uses do we want, or would we want to take near each other? And since this is a balancing act between being able to comply with our allocated housing need by income band. We have our housing targets. You may recall some of those graphs, but 1,433 emergency housing units between 2019 and 2044, and then 759 permanent supportive housing units by 2019 to 2044. So if we can comply or confidently accommodate those units, we can consider some of these kind of horizontal separations. We don't expect all emergency housing types to be 200 units, but there are some, and there may be more that come. So that's why we considered including this provision, creating a horizontal separation. So within 500 feet of a project that has the capacity for 200 people or more, you would, a new project with a capacity of 200 people or more would not be able to locate within that 500-foot radius. But a smaller project could, because these projects range. Hospitality House has a capacity for 9 beds versus 200. So just showing the range of what is out there. Emergency shelters would require a type 1 review regardless. So sorry. And emergency shelters operate a little different than emergency housing. Where emergency housing residents could stay up to a month, a couple of months. Sometimes we're seeing even staying longer. Emergency shelters, occupants may stay maybe just one day, and it could really ebb and flow with the different items, with the different conditions. For example, emergency shelters also are really responsive to severe weather. Okay, that maybe will help the situation, I'm not sure. So emergency shelters require type 1 review regardless of the size. And we are also including this provision, and this was something discussed at length with the Planning Commission, of an increased horizontal buffer of 1,000 feet for those projects that are have the capacity for 200 or more. An example of an emergency shelter project in Burien would be the Highline United Methodist Church. Some key code changes, or basically result or input from the Planning Commission's recommendation, was to include these emergency shelter and emergency housing horizontal separations. Really, it was an increase from 500 feet to 1,000 feet for the emergency shelters. And a lengthy conversation about bicycle parking. A lot of occupants or future residents of step housing types might not have cars, but may have bikes. So ensuring that our parking requirements, both for cars and bikes, are responsive to the different residents of step housing types, particularly in our mixed use and residential zones. And as well as requiring, and this was from previous conversations, but we thought it was great to highlight that community transparency is really important. We heard and want to honor that. So when step housing types register, and we'll go through that process next, but to require on-site noticing, so a sign that says this type of step housing use is proposed, and here's a description, and here's where you can get more information, and here's a link to the city website where we maintain this information, so that there can be basically help answer questions as they come along. And I think this is appropriate time to dive into what the actual process looks like, because I think you might enjoy some of the provisions we've included with step housing types. Some of the things that we heard from step housing providers is, well, they're not always developers. They're trying to fill a gap in this housing continuum and meet the need. And sometimes, a lot of times, each city has their own separate type of requirements and their own processes, even from how you apply for a permit and upload your application. It can be tricky. And so requiring all step housing types or proposals and expansions of step housing uses to go through a pre-application conference is an opportunity for, first of all, the city to get a inside look at the beginning of or the development of a proposal. So we're aware of what's coming in, but then also be able to kind of handhold the process in terms of what they can expect, what we expect in terms of timing, since this step housing permit process is a little different than what we would require for just regular apartment complexes or other housing types. The permit review is dependent on the housing type or the step housing use. I dabbled in this earlier. Emergency shelters require a type 1, which is elevated. It's more expensive. It takes more time. It's a more lengthy review. Emergency housing, when it has a certain number of units, it's bumped up to a type 1 review. Whereas permanent supportive housing and transitional housing, in no areas are we suggesting it become a type 1 based on how we anticipate it to kind of this use to operate in the city. And just because it's a permitted outright use, we will still be reviewing for compliance, whether it's through the building permit. And if it's a new building, it's still going to have to go through design review. And as part of, permit review, there's fire, building code, and all these other kind of review components. We require all step housing types to register with the city. This is also a great opportunity for the city to maintain contacts and as well as kind of feed this desire for transparency. So having this registration available to the public is a great way to keep tabs, as well as tracking our progress to meeting our housing need by 2044. So when we go back to submit reports to King County, we can confidently be tracking how our step housing portfolio is looking, or the landscape in Burien. Although notice of registration, notifying the public, is something that deviates based on step housing use. We didn't think that a step housing use in the single family zones of 3 units or less needs to notify the entire neighborhood that you're moving in. A lot of these, for example, that duplex from Fusion, those residents, have case managers and stuff like that, but that development type is really meant to integrate with the neighborhood, and it doesn't necessarily need to be called out, and has less concerns as maybe some of the step housing uses that have additional on-site services. And so a provision included in the code is said, well, if you have a step housing use in the single family zones, those services that might be provided on site are just for the residents. Whereas, emergency housing and emergency shelter, it can be a lot more fluid with who's coming in and coming out. So we said, okay, notice of registration for these small projects shouldn't be required, as well as for confidential shelters. So if there's a shelter that focuses or emphasizes on working with victims of domestic violence, we don't need to be, highlighting the location just for safety reasons. So that's another provision. And then neighborhood meetings. So the notice of registration is a mailer. It goes 500 feet from the property line of the project to the neighbors around. So it's a neighborhood meeting. And based on the project, you may be required to host 2 neighborhood meetings. And I'm going to just jump to the next slide. This is mostly the same information, but it's just another way to look at it. So being able to compare and contrast how we're regulating shelters and emergency housing from permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. You'll notice that the type 1 review, there's a 1 next to emergency housing. It's because it's dependent on the size. And you'll notice that the notice of registration and the neighborhood meeting requirements is dependent on the size of the project or where it's located. Emergency shelters or emergency housing, like I mentioned, would require a type 1 when it has more than 35 residents or 35 individuals, because it could be, residents. It could be units or beds. Sorry. Yes. Next. Here, this is another way to look at the information. So registration is always required for step housing. The noticing requirement doesn't apply to permanent supportive housing or transitional housing projects with 4 units or less or 10 beds or less in the residential zones. And confidential shelters are kind of exempt from the noticing requirements. Neighborhood meetings are also exempt for those smaller projects of 4 units or 10 beds or less in residential zones, as well as for confidential shelters. And then 2 meetings are required for emergency shelters with capacity of 35 units or more. So that was maybe one piece I didn't highlight. So a second neighborhood meeting, one at the kind of development phase, and 2 like within 2 weeks before they begin operations, they would host we'd require them to host another neighborhood meeting to answer questions. And that's when the emergency shelter is big enough to host 35 individuals at a time or more. So the next steps, that's tonight, we're presenting Planning Commission's recommendation for your consideration. And at our next meeting on November 18th, we will be introducing the ordinance and hopefully a final adoption decision made on December 9th. And any questions or discussion?
Thank you very much for this presentation on the important decision we're going to make for the future of the planning of this in the city. So as we just saw, we're going to have the ordinance introduced next meeting. So this is a great opportunity to ask questions and provide any guidance for what you'd like to see change. If there's anything you'd like to see change, this is for that. Now we won't maybe making motions or anything because the ordinance isn't in front of us yet, but this is a great opportunity to kind of give Liz and Cheney direction for what we'd like to see potentially be included differently or changed or modified. So with that, anyone have anything to start off? Councilmember, Deputy Mayor Mora.
I just have a question real quick. Are thumbs up okay if we all kind of?
Yeah, we'll do for things that council members potentially would bring up, we'll do a thumbs up to give you direction. But we won't take any votes, but just so you can see if there's support for something to include in the potential ordinance. So would anyone like to start off with questions, comments? Councilmember Moore, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question, and the comment is this: just the vocabulary of step housing is really, really helpful. Just having everybody statewide, right, using the same phrases for the same types of places where people can be, I think is helpful and will be helpful in future conversations. And I'm just committed to trying to always describe things accurately as laid out by step housing. I think that it's going to be something that we can all have a shared vocabulary on, and I appreciate that. I did have a question about places that already exist. If a place is already in existence and meets the requirements for a public meeting, do they still need to do that, or are they kind of pre-existed in?
They would be kind of grandfathered in. We still would like them to register so that we can track them, and we've built an inventory, so we'll probably want to still coordinate with them to be tracking those units that exist, but only if they're proposing to expand. And I believe it's 50% gross floor area of their existing structure. Would we then trigger kind of these new development regulations that weren't in place when they maybe were approved the first time?
Thank you.
Of course.
Any other? Deputy Mayor Mora?
Yeah, so I was hoping that we could prioritize Burien residents into these types of housing. Is that something that we can add to the step housing?
That's a good question. We got it a couple times at Planning Commission too. It is a like admirable desire to want to make sure that, locally we got our bases covered. Something that we found while reading the guidance from the Department of Commerce is that a lot of these step housing providers are funded by a variety of public sources. And a lot of those sources have stipulations on how you choose your residents or how you choose who you serve, or how you, don't limit yourself on who you may serve. So when discussing this kind of concept with some of the existing providers in Burien, like for example, Mary's Place, it could be a really, there could be some pretty awful unintended consequences with trying to preserve some of the capacity, say for a single night for units that for Burien residents when there's a high need for high-risk individuals or, especially in the case of Mary's Places with children. Sorry to dive in.
I might add just briefly, one of the examples that when we had our panel that Mary's Place spoke of was how they prioritize who gets a bed. And one of the examples was a woman who's just had a baby and has a newborn. We want to make sure we can give her a bed if it's available. And that person would take precedence in their, in their scenario, regardless of where the person had been living previously. But really, it's more about who has the greatest need. And so that was, I think, very clearly heard through a lot of the providers as well. So they have funding issues, but also that idea of trying to really be available for those with the greatest need.
Just to go a little bit more on that, I do, I'm not against having housing here in Burien, but I do think prioritizing people that are already here helps the Burien's need, and I'm hoping that is something that we can see in the draft ordinance. And also I was hoping we could do a some sort of committee, an advisory committee for this. As well. That is one of the things that I saw with DESC also prioritizing Burien. I think that was one of the things that helped out a lot. And I would like to see an advisory committee also prioritizing our folks here.
Can I add something to that just to do a little context on what we did with DESC? So if you remember, we did two requirements for the DESC project. We did priority placement, the first 30% of the beds, priority placement for Burien folks. And then we did a community advisory board organization to meet regularly to work with DESC. I think that makes a lot of sense for a specific certain size, having a community advisory board requirement. I think it does make a lot of sense for the permanent supportive housing size over 35 units. So alongside one of the requirements for a neighborhood placement of a larger permanent supportive housing building, I think it makes sense to have a community neighborhood group exist to be involved in that, to stay involved, to stay as a community. But then I also think this year showed more than anything, we as a community really do need beds available for especially emergency shelter beds available for folks who are homeless. I think this year showed more than anything, we need more beds for that purpose. But that's my thought. We won't. We'll see if other folks around the table want to say anything on these two things that Deputy Mayor Moore brought up.
May I provide a bit of feedback?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. One of the things that we heard continuously was that all of the regulations, and when we put more on, it makes it harder and harder to cite these projects and more expensive. One of the problems or, challenges of a community advisory group is time and cost, and those do add up quite a bit. So I think, add that into your calculations, but whenever we take more time to get a project online, all of the carrying costs really grow and grow. Now, through a type 1 permit process, there's a lot of opportunity for community engagement. We've noticed it. We have a public meeting. So we're trying to provide some of that structure around it, but at the same time not prevent someone from locating because they can't take the year-long process for the community advisory board. So that is, kind of feedback we received directly from the providers. So just one thing to consider in that.
Go ahead, Councilmember Akey.
I understand the requirement first that we provide step housing. And I'm in favor of being able to provide housing within the community. One of the things that had been concerns within the community about DESC was the impact to the community, right? For that permanent supportive housing. And, you know, they have a good neighbor policy. They did set up an advisory committee. There is some negative activity that is occurring around the building once in a while here. I don't know all the details of that. But I want to make sure that when we are putting in certain kinds of housing, especially if it's going to require low barrier, allowing for drug and alcohol use on property, that there is some protections for the community to make sure that the people that are living in those places recognize their impact to the neighborhood and to the community ongoing, not just as they're building it, but as it continues. And this is something that I'm a little concerned about people not receiving the level of treatment and care that they need based upon the type of either substance use disorder or severe mental health that they might have in these facilities, and trying to ensure that the people that are in there living in there are safe and protected and in healthy environments, and that the community is in a safe and healthy and protected environment. So is there within this ordinance or in the future planning of these properties, that kind of awareness and protection of the people living in facilities and the surrounding community?
I can take a start on this and then I'll ask Janie to join in if she has more. Part of the code does require a code of conduct that the actual providers provide that to the city. It becomes a part of our permit record. So if things are not happening according to the code of conduct, we do have some enforcement capabilities. We also have, the enforcement capabilities of our police if there are illegal activities going on. So that is part of the code that was recommended to you by the Planning Commission, was to have that. I also think that a lot of the issues around whether it's low barrier or high barrier or how it's operated, a lot of that is really in funding mechanisms. And I know that the city also provides resources for some of these as well, but that is also a good, another tool. When you add all of these tools together, you have the code, the land use code that requires code of conduct, you have funding mechanisms where you have some, kind of ability to control things there as well. So there are different layers, I think, of all of these regulations, and this is just the one zoning code layer.
Okay. Will this code of conduct, do we have a sample code of conduct that can give a guidance on the level of that code of conduct? And then something addressing enforcement options or of like how that would be enforced?
Oh, I'll just say that in terms of enforcement, these projects would be subject to the same kind of enforcement that we do with code enforcement. If there's a complaint that comes in and if the project isn't living up to how we regulated it or what regulations it should be meeting, then that's grounds for noticing a violation, and there's a whole process and procedures set for that. These would not be exempt from that process.
I'll just add in as well. In the code, we actually recognize some items that need to be included in that code of conduct. And I think your idea of kind of, hey, this is a great code of conduct that we can have available as an example. I think that's a good idea and something that we could have, as part of our materials. We're also going to be preparing quite a bit of public information on this. And the Planning Commission had asked us to look at really setting up a pretty robust webpage as well, where people can go and see these registration notices. They can see where the projects are located other than the smaller ones and the confidential ones. But they can actually understand, who do I contact if there is a problem? So having contact information. The Planning Commission also supported having a training plan for staff that are on site so that we actually understand what are the trainings that you're giving your staff and how are you keeping people up to date with their skills. So that was another tool that the Planning Commission chose to recommend.
Thank you.
Any other council members besides council members who have spoken already? Okay,
Just
then we'll
comment.
go. Oh,
No,
go ahead, Councilmember Garcia, go ahead.
Comment, no question. Thank you for the information. I don't have any requests or additions. I think the information requested by my colleagues covered anything that I may have wanted to include. So thank you again for the STEP presentation, and yeah, look forward to keep it moving.
Thank you. So let's go Councilmember Moore and then Deputy Mayor Mora.
Thank you. My question has to do, so step housing is rolling out everywhere, right? Is that correct? And is there any coordination or awareness among different local municipalities or South King County municipalities or neighboring cities about what, like, and I don't want to know the locations of anything anywhere outside of Burien, but kind of what is the inventory in different places, and are there communities that are being left out of all of a regional inventory of step housing, and is there a way to kind of identify those needs?
You know, I believe the Department of Commerce is really the one that's kind of keeping the big overview across the state. And also King County has some of that role. So I know that Department of Commerce has provided a lot of guidance on model codes and ordinances. And so they're the ones that are kind of, they're the arbiters. Are you meeting, are you doing what you need to do to meet the identified need in your comprehensive plan? But they will be keeping track of the number of beds and units and projects, across the state.
I just might add that I think part of the intent behind House Bill 1220 was to ensure that everyone is kind of starting at a similar level playing field. Let's all define these terms. Let's all allow them as permitted uses in these zones. And like, for example, permanent supportive housing and transitional housing in residential zones, and then emergency shelters and emergency housing in zones that allow for hotels. So I think that, like, in some way, we're trying to prevent some cities from not meeting at least a standard in terms of where these should be expected. And then one other piece was, I come from the city of Federal Way, and unlike Burien, Federal Way has a number of old motels and hotels along Pack Highway. And so in terms of, what does this look like in some other places? And in some places, it's easier to build step or to reoccupy existing structures for step housing because the tenant improvement investments are less than putting up a brand new structure. So that's something that I have personal awareness of in terms of what it might look like, but.
It seems like if there's a more global process, it could help identify types of step housing that are challenging or that aren't attracting anybody to create, and maybe do a little looking into what's happening with those types of step housing.
I think that's absolutely the case. And that's part of, I believe, why we're going to be required to monitor our numbers and provide that feedback to Commerce so that they can look out across the greater, community and to kind of say, well, this is working, this isn't. And then, of course, they can also update and make it more attractive to do what's working potentially in future legislation.
Thank you. Go ahead, Deputy Mayor Mora, and then Councilmember Andrade.
So one of the things that I do want to see in this, wanted to see if any other council members would agree with this, but I do want to see a homelessness use policy within this ordinance. This is something that I saw Bellevue do, and I really admire them for them. I like their code that they have. It's specifically code 20.20.455. And I was hoping we could see something brought with this ordinance, and it's the city is kind of more in control, more or less what happens. And I think this would be more binding than a good neighbor policy is, like what DESC has. And so I'm hoping this is something that we could see done here as well.
So I took a note of that. At the end of this conversation, we'll go a little more in depth on that and ask for thumbs of support. So everybody keep that in mind. So can you repeat what the sort of the title of it is?
Oh, let's see what, well, the code for Bellevue they use, it's code 20.20.455. Bellevue has it named homeless services uses.
Okay, thank you. So we'll come back to that towards the end of our conversation, ask for thumbs up.
Mayor,
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt.
Go
but if
ahead.
you'd like some feedback, I have enacted that code section in my previous position and can provide some feedback if you would like.
please.
So 2024-55 actually encompasses all of the homeless services uses, so very similar, except for permanent supportive housing and transitional housing. So it talks about the homeless shelters and homeless transition.
Oh, transitional housing or
Yeah.
emergency shelters, emergency
Emergency
housing?
shelters and emergency housing. Thank you, Cheney. And it has a very extensive process, which I think Deputy Mayor Moore is speaking to, and it's called the Good Neighbor Advisory Agreement Committee. And we had one whole section of the GNAC committee, as the initials were. And in that case, it took us well over a year to get to yes. It also took massive city resources because we had to stand up a committee with about 20 people and then another more citizens beyond that. And there were many members of the city staff. The fire department was represented, police was represented, public works was represented, planning. We had to hire a facilitator to handle these meetings. The city paid for that because we did not want to put that on to the community that was trying to cite their project. So we had, I think, 6 or 8 meetings of this committee. The council is required to appoint the members of the committee. So there's quite a lengthy process. It was well over 1 year from, kind of start to finish, where the shelter couldn't move forward with their project. So it was done for the East Side Men's Shelter. And we ended up with a report at the end and, again, lots of hours, lots of money. The report was not substantially different than what had happened previously. The applicant had already been meeting with the community, had the community meetings. There really weren't a lot of changes to the end result of what was built. So I caution adopting that section in whole. I think that there are a lot of challenges with that we experienced firsthand in trying to go through it, and also the expense. And quite frankly, City of Burien doesn't have the staffing to be able to support that level of review at this point in time. That may change, hopefully. Love to have more staff, but right now we would be very challenged to do that and certainly couldn't afford to pay for a facilitator to run that process either. So I certainly don't mean to be negative, but it was a challenging process.
Would that be something that whoever's building or wants to put in something here, is that something that they could just pay for instead of the city having to pay for that?
I think it's like everything. These projects are generally on a shoestring and they're just barely making it. We've just had additional requests for money to the skip housing for a couple of the projects that are on the boards right now, including the Habitat for Humanity and so on. They're all right at the edge. It's expensive to develop in general, and it's even more expensive when you're trying to do it all on grants. So, putting that additional cost onto the applicants is very challenging.
I appreciate that history. I think I will say though, we are hearing some interest to have some form of codified community oversight of this process and approval, especially since we successfully did it with our biggest permanent supportive housing project with DESC. We successfully did it. And also, not to mention, I've had other cities approach me and say, how did you do that? I want to do that in my community. And I've had people from Redmond come and talk to me about it. And I had a Plymouth housing person who had that situation in Kenmore and Redmond come and talk to me about what we did to work with the community and get folks not necessarily on board, but to have the community be involved. So I think there is interest to have something like that codified. We can come back to that at the end of this conversation to see where people are at with that. But just wanted to lay that out there. Councilmember Andrade.
I guess going back to the code of conduct, I had a question about the code of conduct that Planning Commission had recommended. Is that something that currently is based off of something that exists that they're using with Mary's Place or Hospitality House? Or is this something that would be new and then implemented for all?
I'd say all of the organizations that are providing services in Burien today have a code of conduct. We were recommending that there be some flexibility that they could use their existing documentation and then gave them some things that we really wanted to see within it. So we did not try and put together a separate document that they would have to do.
So it would be, okay, standard then for all. Is that correct? The language and the verbiage that would be used?
Some of the elements would be standard, so we would require certain elements, but no, we actually did not want to put the burden on them of having to create a Burien-specific code of conduct, but instead have certain elements that were important for us, and those are listed out in the proposed code, and then let them generally use what they have, hopefully, so that it's not another burden.
Okay, and then I have a second question. The community meetings, is that something that would include the school districts and or schools, neighboring schools?
That's a great question and something that came up too. We've actually been thinking about how we can engage the school district when these projects come in. So we have the pre-application conference, and that's a good opportunity for us to gather our information and to, being good partners with our school district. But something that I've maybe shared at council, I've at least shared at planning commission, based on data from the Highline School District, there are a lot of students that are qualifying for McKinney-Vento. While not all students qualifying for McKinney-Vento are Burien residents in the Highline School District, because the school district serves multiple cities and areas, it basically just demonstrated a need to have some of these uses near schools, because there are children and student age children, I guess, I don't know, children that need these housing options. And it gets expensive for all types of agencies trying to keep, routine and their social ties and connections. So, regardless if it's, the McKinney-Vento students are across the district, there was still kind of enough, I think, input from Highline, the McKinney-Vento coordinator, to want to justify, not limiting these housing uses near schools, but maybe also trying to kind of pair these resources. But sorry, that didn't answer your question. Your question is about notifying the school district. I think we heard that from the planning commission and are evaluating ways to keep them involved and engaged, or at least aware of what's coming down the line.
I'll just briefly add on that one. The school district is actually invited to our pre-application conferences at this point in time, but I think we should elevate those projects so that they really make sure they know. And so that is the venue that we thought would be best to bring them into the conversation very early so that they are aware of what's going on and any potential planning needs that they have as well.
Councilmember Ake?
Mayor, if I may make a point of information,
Yes.
not related to the conversation, but we have learned that there are technical difficulties with the live stream component. The online component through Zoom remains available, so anyone can log in, but live stream itself is experiencing some technical difficulties that we're working to resolve. Thank you.
Mike,
Okay,
check.
thank you.
Mike, check. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good. You're good,
Okay.
Councilmember Garcia. It's just
Oh.
people trying to watch
Got it.
the city live stream. Yeah, okay. Okay, Councilmember Ake.
One comment, one question. Comment being, a facility like DESC, which specializes in chronically homeless, primarily men, a few women, but not families, is a different project in my view than Mary's Place or some other kind of use. And that my hope is that we'd be recognizing those kinds of uses and protections around schools or something if we need to. I mean, I'm just a little concerned about saying, oh, every single use can be by a school and there's not certain impacts that might be happening unless, you know, this good neighbor policy is really like working and doing what it needs to do.
I will say the planning commission had some questions about whether you could regulate by the type of user, and we cannot. That would, we cannot regulate by the class of user other than we can regulate by the type of use. So a permanent supportive housing that is available to single men has to be regulated the same way as a permanent supportive housing use that is populated by women and children. We can't discriminate in any way by that, in that way.
Okay.
I think at this point, we do not have any regulations, you know, around schools. I had a personal situation where my children were in middle school and across the street, they put up a tent city and it turned out fine. But I remember the fears, I remember the concerns, but I also know that it became something that became part of the community as well. And the school actually went out of the way to try and, you know, build a relationship and make sure that that they knew who was there, they knew who was running it. They made, you know, they created some bonds that helped get through that. But it is, I know it can sound, you know, very scary, but we also have these types of uses all over the city today. And we really, you know, have had very, very good experiences, I would say, you know, from what I understand and talking to planning commission members and all of you that, you know, majority of these are really going very well. But it is something that we can't regulate by who's in the bed.
Okay.
If I may add to Liz's response, Mary's Place is an emergency housing project.
Yeah, it's different.
And
Yes.
PSH is different, and I think PSH kind of, it has a different resident that they're catering to, those with more like disabling needs, where emergency housing is like pending eviction, you know, one is serving someone who's been chronically homeless and one who's serving a family in an imminent need because of, you know, sleeping in a car or, you know, it's a little bit of a different situation. I may be reading in between the lines and I could be totally wrong, but if your concern is around like sex offenders living in these projects near schools, nothing in this code prevents the application of community protection zones, which already exists in state law, the 880 feet. So this step housing doesn't negate the applicability of these protections that are already existing in state law.
Okay.
And I
Thank
think,
you.
especially with permanent supportive housing, that's one of the only step housing types that is required to be a dwelling unit. It's required to, has a little bit more documentation to it. You are regulated by the Tenant Landlord Act. There's kind of more information than maybe how emergency housing and emergency shelters operate. But regardless, I wanted to, if that's what was maybe one of your concerns, I wanted to address it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other council members with thoughts or concerns to bring up for?
Mayor.
Go ahead, Councilmember Garcia.
Thanks. I just had a question for Liz. And you might not have the exact amount, but I was wondering if you had a range of the cost of the project that you mentioned in Bellevue for that code, because I am in support to find a way to codify it, but I'd also like to find out like how much did the city actually pay for all that? Roughly. Or estimate.
That's a
Doesn't
good
have to be
question. I think our facilitator was at least 150 an hour. And I know we spent a lot of hours with her, so we probably spent 100 hours with her alone. Then we had all of the city staff time. Again, as I mentioned, that particular code requires quite a few city staff members. So I was at every meeting, my senior planner was at every meeting. You know, I don't have billable hours in my role, but she did at $165 an hour. And then also we had the other city staff members. So I would venture to guess that it was at least $50,000 by the time we put all of that together. But I could try and get more, better numbers. But it was a very expensive proposition. Certainly here in Burien, that would be a big impact to our budget.
Thanks. Just wanted to get an idea of it. Thank you. That was all.
Go ahead, Councilmember Ike.
My other question was centered around that. Is your proposal that's within this ordinance now, for what you were trying to do, kind of a good compromise in being able to, enact this kind of, community engagement and understanding of the different projects and things like that? What do you feel in terms of comparison of what you're presenting to what they had done in Bellevue, I guess is my question.
Sure. I actually believe that the Planning Commission struck a nice balance. We have the notice of registration that goes out to your neighbors essentially. And that's also posted on site. So if someone's driving by, they can see the sign, hey, this is coming up. So they have an opportunity to be engaged. And then we have a minimum of one public meeting. And for the more intensive uses, we have two. We have requirements around providing information about who's the contact person, who's your local contact person. If in fact, some of the providers we talked to, Mary's Place, they have operations all over. So who's your local contact person? We required some of those things as well. So I feel like having all of that actually does provide a nice balance. It is a balance because we don't want to make it impossible for people to be here, but at the same time, the Planning Commission was very clear, and we heard them, that they really want people to feel like they know what's coming. What is this? What is coming to my community? And who are the people? And so they can start to build those relationships up. So this seemed like a good compromise.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Councilmember Mata.
Well, thank you very much. I think the step housing we're the first city to tackle it in the county. And so it's important that we start thinking about, what are the things that could come about with some of the housing. I think that there's no good neighbor policy in some of the neighbors that, that sometimes venture around my neighborhood, right? So I don't think that we should have, one rule for one person, a rule for another. But I do think that if it's something that we look at, that maybe the nuisance ordinances, then we can tighten the nuisance ordinance if that's what we need to do. Because I do even think that some of these apartment complexes, I mean, they have nuisance that are going on, and these aren't places that are set up as step housing. They're just low-income housing that there's just no rules in place, right? And so I think if we say, well, what could be a nuisance, then maybe we could go look at the ordinance within a nuisance. But I do believe that at some point we have to have housing. And I think this is in the right direction. And I want to thank the commission. I think this is a well thought out process, and being one of the first cities in the county to tackle this, I think they've done a great job. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Councilmember Mata. I do want to point out too, before we do a thumbs up on seeing council's desire to put something within the ordinance around codifying a community, kind of a community involvement plan. I do want to just point direction a little bit to figure 1 in the document. And I agree, this is a great document overall and excellent recommendation. I do just want to point to figure 1 on the document. Yes, we've got to hit our emergency housing and our permanent supportive housing goals, but to not take away from the fact that our #1 greatest need as a community, with over 3,000 housing units is over 120% AMI. That we are a community that has a dearth of new mid-range 120% AMI market housing. And I just wanted to point that out, that this is a huge discrepancy of where we're needing a large investment as well, like over 3,000 units of over 120% AMI. So just wanted to point that out, that yes, we're doing what we need to do for STEP, but we also need to ensure that we hit our goals at the highest level as well. This is all our housing goals overall, not one or the other, everything we need to hit. So, okay, so could I see thumbs? This is for asking Liz and Cheney to return with the ordinance to include some form, and I think we can look at what we did with DESC, some form of community advisory involvement or requirement for permanent supportive housing and emergency housing that'd be over 35 units. Okay, no, all right. So no interest in that. So no changes to, right now, no direction of changes to be presented to us in our ordinance for next meeting.
Thank you. We will bring back the proposed ordinance at the next meeting. And you can decide if you'd like to move it on to consent for the first meeting in December.
Great. Thank you very much.